Okay, well, good morning and welcome back, AP Hug Life. When we left off yesterday, we left off with this slide and some technical difficulties, and now, 5 hours away and 24 hours later, let's see if these technical difficulties have indeed been alleviated. So, let's look at what comes from the concept of decolonization. Okay, here we go. What comes from decolonization is the concept of a nation. And a nation is a group of people with a shared cultural heritage or a shared belief. It is a group of people who have loyalty towards one another and towards the group as a whole. They desire self determination, basically the ability to be sovereign and govern themselves. And they have a distinct homeland. And this is an important part. Even if no one is living there, they have a place that they consider home. So and this, the best example of that would be what is now Israel, or no, that'd be the best example, because the Kurdish nation, which we'll get to in a little bit, there is a defined area, and there are Kurds, well, a sort of defined area, and there are Kurds living there. But Israel is sort of the best example of a place recognized as a homeland where the majority of the people weren't living. All right, so here we go. We're going to spend the next part of today looking at different types of nations and challenges facing different nations, and then we'll go from there. So the difference between a state and a nation, basically, it's recognition and fixed border. Let's see what the notes say. All right, so how do nations and states interact? Well, one, there are multinational states. So this is remember, state is, hold on, country. It's just America, because our states are unique and because the creation of America is so unique. Just states and country, one term. Just remember on the exam or anytime you see any document or anything discussing states and other parts of the world, they're referring to countries. A multinational state is just that, it is a state or a country that has different nationalities, different cultural, ethnical groups, within them. Okay, and if you can think of some examples, have at it. Again, more than one nation and its borders. Remember, a nation are the four things previously discussed: shared culture, a belief in that culture, and a belief in the collective, a desire to be sort of self-determinate. Okay. Okay. The Russian Federation is the world's largest multinational state in the world. If you're not aware of it, there are many groups other than ethnic Russians in this land. I mean, it also doesn't hurt that Russia's huge. Are the largest country, geographically speaking, in the world. So you're going to encompass a lot of ethnicities, a lot of nationalities, a lot of different groups. And this even goes back much more so. Notice this is the Russian Federation. So this is not, make this perfectly clear, this is not Russia, the country, because there is a country of Russia. The Russian Federation is Russia and all the other satellite countries, which is a term we'll get to shortly, that border it or that are part of this greater Russianness. Okay. Canada is a multinational state with two nations, the French Canadians in the province of Quebec and other parts in the eastern provinces, but predominantly Quebec. And then there's the rest of English-speaking Canada. So that's a multinational state. And it says at least two because there are also indigenous peoples in the northern reaches of Canada that would fall under the category of a nation. Okay, now keep going. By the way, one of the best national anthems in the world is O Canada. All right, now the concept of a nation state. Again, it's hyphenated, so it's one entity. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but since I don't want to assume, it's a state with primarily one nation within its borders. Makes sense. Multinational state has many nations. A nation state, one, primarily one nation, vast majority. And there are many examples, including the one coming. Iceland is almost 93, it's 93% Icelandic. It's one nation. Japan, Korea, those are excellent examples of nation states, places where the vast majority of the population see themselves as one particular entity. And again, that's why the United States is such a difficult, I think, and challenging nation or country, state to classify, because how do you what do you classify as nations here, besides Native American ones? What is an American, which is the question we asked at the beginning of this whole cultural unit, and in the unit prior. And what does it mean to be American? So it's a challenge. That doesn't mean it can't be answered, and it doesn't mean that you, as you go through this course or as you read other things, can't come to a conclusion as to what you think, um, what description best fits America. I'm just merely saying that it makes for some interesting conversation. And again, why would this be the most cohesive type of state? And if you don't know what cohesive means, just think of adhesive, something that sticks together, something that's going to hold a state together. Why would a nation state be the most cohesive type of state? And again, just refer to the previous unit, refer to all things that go into a culture, the things that go into an ethnicity, how that builds into the concept of nation, and then why would a nation state theoretically thrive and work best. The next term today is the stateless nation. Again, stateless, without a state, meaning without what? And remember, to be a state, there were four things you had to have. So if any one of those four don't exist, it's kind of like fire. Then there's no state, there's no fire. So you have to have all four of those components. Excuse me. Typically, the component most often missing, um, is the land. There's a desire. There are places in the world who recognize these nations as deserving a state. Um, it's just getting the actual borders and the land itself, excuse me, is the biggest holdup for most of these. Again, it's a nation that has no territory of its own, but it is implied it should. So again, as I just stated, the world at large, or enough of the world at large, acknowledges that they really should have a state. They really should be their own country. That's it. Posture matters. All right, so that's what a stateless nation is, and the best example of a stateless nation are the Kurds. Those of you who plan on taking my international relations class, the Kurds always come up, because it's worth talking about. They're a stateless nation. They live in the contiguous, which means connected areas, like the 48 states of the United States. That's the contiguous United States because they're connected. And they live in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And they live in an area where all four of those states come together. Like the next slide. There it is. Okay, it's kind of difficult to see. So roughly speaking, this is where the vast majority of the Kurds live. And there's your big border. So here's Iran, there's Turkey, there's Syria, and there is Iraq, because I see Mosul. And they live in other places too. They live in Armenia. But this is the land that was Kurdistan, because notice here's Turkey. And we discussed earlier, or it was discussed earlier, or maybe it was just a PowerPoint or notes I was watching, that Turkey, in its height of nationalism, in the height of Turkey becoming Turkey, forced them out, denied them their land, took Kurdistan from them. So they're there and they're staring into Turkey, into what was once their land. And so this is a group of people who don't have a technical state, but there is worldwide recognition that, and not by everyone, but there is worldwide recognition that they should. Many Kurds advocate for the establishment of their own state to be created from parts of other states they live in. This is irredentism. Irredentism is taking parts of countries to make a new state. Irredentism is how we got Israel. Irredentism is, well, I don't think you can call the carving of Africa irredentism, or the creation of these countries, Iran, places like this in Southwest Asia, irredentism, because there really weren't defined borders. You could call Turkey's creation, I would argue, irredentism. It would depend on how you chose to define a state. Like, do you feel? And I know, and we know, literally speaking, and we probably can understand, legally speaking, what makes a state. But you as a human being, or you as you, like Iran, the peoples living in Iran, or the peoples who were living in Syria before, or Transjordan, which is what was created post World War One. Do those people in those regions, because it was the Ottoman Empire, do the nations or the groups, does what they control mean enough or seem legitimate enough to where when Europe went and carved it up, their land was being taken from them? So, I mean, it would just really depend on how you want to define land, as to whether to assume whether or not irredentism was taking place there. The formation of Israel is again a very easy example, because we know that was land that was carved and made into something else. For centuries, and as I said, the Jewish nation was stateless. It was scattered around the world. Diaspora is a vocabulary term, and that is the spreading of people, can be the spreading of ideas. It just means the spreading of something over a wide area. They understood themselves to be Jewish. I mean, there was definitely a Jewish nation. And they all recognized Palestine as being theirs, because it goes back to the Abrahamic promises at the formation of their faith. Other things we're going to look at now: buffer states and zones. And again, buffer states or buffer zones. It's just not zones. Just take buffer and okay. And they are, as you would think they are, they serve as interference or safety. It's a state located between two larger states that are conflicting. Okay, and it has to be in conflict, or else you're really not a buffer. Then you're just, a longer trip. Mongolia is considered a buffer state between Russia and China. It's also worth knowing that, historically speaking, Mongolia was an issue to both Russia and China. In fact, this is why we have these peoples. The Mongolians are one of the peoples that necessitated the wall, Great Wall, and the Mongols are also one of the greatest horsemen. Conquered most of Russia. They were into Europe. They're very influential, and as you know from John Green, they are the exception. Eastern Europe itself, all of Eastern Europe. By the way, going back to the Russian Federation, for the longest time, these countries were part of the Federation, and part of Russia Minor. These are the buffer zones, and these states came about. They were communist. They were under Soviet control. Notice there's a separate Germany there. That is East Germany. This was Czechoslovakia. This was Yugoslavia. But when the Russians went west, and helped defeat the Nazis in World War II, they left troops here and never left this land. And the reason they did this was, one, land is money, but two, to provide a buffer from any future German invasion or any other invasion, because Germany had eyed this land for a long time. There's oil down here. This was going to be their farmland for the Reich. So to make themselves feel safer, and if for no other reason, just to make them have to go through more land before they got to somewhere. These are buffer zones that are created, and there are other examples, but the Warsaw Pact nations, the Iron Curtain that descended here, as according to Churchill, that's an excellent example of a buffer zone, as is Mongolia. Satellite states. Again, you know what a satellite is. It's a thing in space, but that doesn't make it a satellite. What makes it a satellite is that it orbits a, a main body. You know that friend that's always hanging around you? Technically speaking, it's a satellite. It is formally independent, but is under a heavy military, economic, and political control by another. So it's out there. It's its own thing, but not really. Again, like that one friend who's out there and wants to be part of the crowd, and you tell it what to do because you're kind of jerky if you're a jerky person, and that person will do it because he knows if he doesn't, he won't be in with the crowd. These are little countries that allow the bigger country to kind of bully it because they know, well, they think and they believe it'll be worth it. Um, and they are controlled by others. And sometimes they don't think it'll be worth it. They just don't have a choice. But it's just a small independent state, formerly independent, that is now sort of being influenced by somebody else, either via peer pressure or out and out, you're going to do this. Can you think of any America has? Can you think of any historical ones? Could you make the argument that Cuba, for the longest time, was a satellite state? Is Puerto Rico a satellite state? I don't know. I'm asking questions, and if you want to take a second and think about, you have to really know which one of these controls is being exerted on the little country. Are all of them, do all have to be exerted? Because I know it says and here, but do all have to be exerted to be a satellite state? I mean, you may not have to send troops if you economically can keep somebody in check. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. Poland was a satellite state of the Soviet Union. That's what USSR means. It's United Soviet Socialist Republic. Until the Iron Curtain fell in the 1990s, until a guy named Lech Walesa started a movement called Solidarity, and basically began to unionize workers in Poland and to push back against um, the Soviet influence in their country. The Czechoslovakia in, I believe, 68 had something called the Velvet Revolution, and they had a little uprising. There were uprisings in other countries in 68 during that time period against the Soviet Union. Some were not dealt with peaceably. But Poland was one of those states, and to go back to that slide about the buffers, all those buffer states, you can make the assertion were satellite states because they were controlled economically, they were controlled with troops, and they basically were at the mercy of the Soviet Union. Shadow belts, excuse me. A shadow belt is a state or a group of states that is influenced by other states, competing states. So their culture or their nation or their economic way of life is influenced um, by larger, more influential countries around them. And it's usually, I mean, as this term, the connotation shadow belt does not sound positive. Okay. So it's a country or a group of countries that's being adversely impacted by the influence of larger, more powerful countries. Um, and there are a lot of countries who would make the assertion that they are shadow belts um, in a passive way because of the influence of American ideals or American culture or American capitalism impacting their culture. And in a way, impacting them politically, because if you want jobs for your people, and I'm an American company, and I will give you my factory. You may have to make certain concessions. You may have to, alter some laws. And as long as I'm there and I'm happy, it's economically good for you until you do something that I don't think makes me happy, or there's another country who can make me happier. So it's basically a country. It's different from a satellite country because it's not being uh, directed. It's much more passive, and it's I mean, there are similarities. I would say maybe they're cousins. but it's not quite the same thing. Mainly because you're looking at it could be a group of states, and it's also because it's not necessarily by one state influencing these changes. When you're what was the other term? Let's go back so I don't forget. Yeah, when you're satellite state, it's typically one country that's influencing you. When you're a shadow belt, there are competing nations, and that competition is the destabilizing force because it forces governments to maybe choose one over another one, and that might not be the better one for you, or choose one company over another country's company, or um, choose one culture over another, or in some cases, I'm sure, um, be influenced by both or more than two. So it serves as a method and a mechanism to destabilize and to really disrupt or shatter the norm of a particular nation or a region of states. So that's what a shatter belt is. That's the longest explanation I've ever given. I actually like this. I feel better about that term. Southeast Asia, the land between India and China, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, maybe Thailand, Singapore, those places. Singapore, not quite because they're so economically sound, but those are states that feel the impact of India to their southwest and China to their north, um, at odds with one another. And China and India are at odds with one another, mainly over water and other areas. But when they have issue, it spills into this region. It spills into this region economically, primarily, I would imagine, because trade's going to stop or be halted or be influenced and hindered, and that affects them. So that's an excellent example of a shadow belt. And again, any questions at any time, please don't hesitate to post them, to bring them up during our office hours. Monday this week is going to be a very important office hour day because, exams Tuesday. Moving on. Okay, now some challenges to the state. So challenges today to countries, not and some are unique to now, and some are just a different form of earlier challenges in the history of the world. So here we go. How can a state help maintain unity within itself? What are some things that can tear a state apart? So what we're going to look at now are two terms, centripetal and centrifugal, or as they say in England, centrifugal forces that either help unite a state or can actually pull a state apart from within. Oh, look at that. So what are centripetal and centrifugal or centrifugal forces? I've had some students argue that they don't exist, or like the terms don't, or it's the same thing in a different direction. Or anyway, if you've ever ridden a ride at a fair where I don't know, there was one when I was growing up as a kid where you would stand against the wall and then it would spin and then the floor would fall and you would stick to the wall. That's centrifugal force. It's also why it's also the machine that separates the the components of blood is a centrifuge because it pulls things apart. Okay. Centripetal forces unite a state, unify a state. Centrifugal forces fragment or pull a state apart. So that's the big difference, okay? Some unifying institutions, some centripetal forces are education, compulsory education, and not necessarily, and I've just been thinking about this, not necessarily in what is taught, because as you will learn later on when you take American history courses, education is technically, literally not anything the federal government can control, has power over. So the fact that we have a Secretary of Education, that Ms. DeVos, is really a non-issue, um, unless you want money from the federal government. Like the whole No Child Left Behind policy, states don't have to do it. You can say, no, North Carolina could do, North Carolina teaches its kids because it's North Carolina policy. Not the best name, kind of like, Shield. But, and there are some states, I believe Utah, the last I checked, Utah does not follow the No Child Left Behind uh, guidelines, or what's the other, Common Core guidelines. Um, but by not accepting it, and this is how the federal government gets you, not gets you, but this is how the federal government can sort of influence areas where it has no legal influence. Um, you get money from the government for your education programs in your state. So if you choose not to um, follow a federal guideline, then you can be withheld, money can be withheld. And some states don't want to do that because if federal funds are withheld, then that means you have to raise state taxes. And no one likes to raise state taxes because who wants to be the politician who's honest and says, look, if we're going to help each other out, you got to pay more in taxes. So they don't do it. So the fact that everybody, so that's a little bit of a non sequitur, but the fact that there is state publicly funded education is a centripetal force, because if everybody's learning, then your state is smarter and you feel better. Holidays are centripetal forces, military services, centripetal forces, and then other things like roads. If they allow ideas to be spread, infrastructure can actually be a centripetal force, because it allows for ideas to be shared, or for people to go from place to place and feel part of a larger community. Military service, voting, believe it or not. Um, like I said before, phone systems, any sort of infrastructure based thing that makes communication with one another or feeling a part of something easier, or something that instills pride. If we've got great schools or great roads, I mean, for the longest time, North Carolina, the state of North Carolina was the good road state, because they allocated funds to keep the roads looking nice, which they should probably do again. Um, Now, centrifugal forces would be ethno-regionalism, or when minority nations within a state um, get angry at their lack of voice and cause turmoil. That can be a centrifugal force. Um, and that's the biggest one. Or distrust in your government institutions, or decisions, or war, anything that makes sense that's not making you love your country is a centrifugal force. Economics. If you're Venezuelan right now, you're not feeling fuzzy warm about your country, mainly because of your economic situation, which, by the way, is not a socialism thing as much as it is a totalitarian thing. So, I mean, anyway, but those are centrifugal forces. Economic difficulties, hyperinflation, depression, which are not the same thing, can be a centrifugal force, because there, you look at the current situation now in America, and you look at how divided we are in the two-party thing, or how people looking at, do I stay in, do we not stay in, do we keep the country shut down? If you have a job and you're working from home, you're much more willing to ride it out. And that's understandable, but it's also a little short-sighted. Um, I think we need to sympathize and or empathize with those who want to go back to work. There are some who want to go back to work because they need to go back to work. They need to go back to work. And then there are others who want a haircut. Yeah, look, I get it, but it's really not a need. Um, but we're divided over stuff like this, to wear a mask or not wear a mask. What I mean, this is, a pandemic is an excellent example of a centrifugal force potentially. We're still a country. We're still one country. And that sounds much more dire than it actually is. But there is disharmony because of this situation. What are some other centrifugal forces that you can think of? And again, take a moment and think about things that you've experienced that fit both these categories. And again, any questions, share them with us next week. Now, how does a state deal with strong forces pulling the nation apart? So how do you address these? If you're a governor or a mayor or a principal. Because remember, or a parent. It's all scalable. How do you address this? How do you address this from a human geographical way? And so, how do you do it? Well, some states transfer power. They give up. I'm going to join this summit meeting. For those of you who don't know, that is former President Ronald Reagan, and that is former Russian Premier, not Yeltsin. Is it Yeltsin? No, Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union when it collapsed. Not his fault. He actually tried to do some cool things. Well, kind of his fault. He tried to do some cool things. He tried to open it up. There was this whole idea called glasnost, which was sort of a warming to the outside world, mainly for economic prosperity. Uh, Somewhat similar to Rome becoming Christian because he felt it would help keep the empire together longer. Um, but one thing he did was he allowed some of the other governments and some of the satellite states to have a bit more autonomy, a bit more authority in their own countries, in the hopes that if they give them more freedoms, they'll be less in a hurry to leave the Soviet Union. And again, this is devolution. By giving by giving those areas, those nations more autonomy, um, perhaps they'll stay with you. And remember, as we stated earlier, this right here is the greatest single cause of nation building, state building in the history of the world. More countries have come from that than anything else. There he is, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, ceded power to individual states like Latvia, the Ukraine. See, no longer a part of Russia, and others, gave them back their power. And notice he served under two presidents because there's George Bush Sr. All right, we will end there for today, and we'll pick up tomorrow with colonialism, which leads to, well, colonialism will allow for devolution to eventually occur. We're going to look at the motivations for colonialism, how that impacts nations, how it impacts the states created from the end of colonialism and devolution today. So we'll pick it up here tomorrow. I hope everybody's doing well. Enjoy your day. Be good to one another. Stay safe. Peace.